Every day, hundreds of thousands of commuters cross the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, and most are entirely oblivious to the fact that for a moment of their journey, they're passing directly above the abandoned home of one of America's greatest war heroes, Admiral Chester Nimitz. That's right, this disregarded structure was formerly occupied by a man who commanded 2 million people, 5,000 ships, and 20,000 aircraft, in what was a force larger than most empires throughout history. Furthermore, the house also served as a powerful site of reconciliation. It was here that high-ranking Japanese naval officers and dignitaries would travel specifically to pay their respects to the man who defeated them. Even Soviet generals were known to visit the site. So how could such an important, symbolic relic of American heritage be falling apart under a concrete bridge? And what, if anything, can be done to save it? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the story of the forgotten mansion under the Bay Bridge. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. To understand the Nimitz House, you first need to understand the island that it sits upon. Yerba Buena Island, which translates from Spanish as Good Herb Island, was named for the mint-like plant that once grew abundantly on its slopes. And it has carried several different names over the centuries. Sailors and settlers called it the Seabird Island, Wood Island, and perhaps most evocatively, Goat Island, a name it earned from the herds of goats that early European settlers once raised there as food. But from the perspective of U.S. history, the island would come to define far more than a source of sustenance. This is because it sits at the geographic midpoint of the San Francisco Bay, a pressure point that was recognized even before California became a state. You see, during the Civil War era, military planes grew anxious about the bay's vulnerability. The fear was that a Confederate ship might slip in at some point through the Golden Gate under the cover of the region's famous fog, from where they could further make their way past the cannons of Fort Point, the fortifications of Alcatraz, and then ultimately wreak havoc on the city's harbor. So, in response to such an unacceptable danger, the idea of an additional military post at Yerba Buena Island began to take shape. Though, curiously, the only conflict that the island saw in that time was the legal battle of the 1860s. Before the army moved in, the area was being used by squatters and goat herders, which had to be removed before they could build the fort. The other challenge was that the Central Pacific Railroad wanted to seize the land for use as a western terminus. All the same, by the 1870s, Camp Yerba Buena had been established, accompanied by the construction of a fog signal and a lighthouse. From that point on, the island's military character would only deepen. In the years following the Spanish-American War of 1898, the country had dramatically expanded its naval ambitions across the Pacific. It was at this point that the Navy took control of the island and transformed it into the first naval training station on the West Coast. This was an important move domestically, but globally, it sent a statement of intent. America was becoming a Pacific power, and San Francisco Bay would be its gateway. By 1900, the base was taking shape. Workers completed the first barracks, and overlooking the entire site, a grand home rose for the commanding officer. That residence would eventually become known as Quarters 1, or more famously, the Nimitz House. The house is by any measure a distinguished piece of architecture. Officially classified as a classical revival wood frame structure, it spans nearly 6,000 feet across 2 stories. Its exterior features columns framing massive porches, windows with diamond-shaped panels, and a wide, sloping lawn that reaches all the way down the hillside. Now, behind the house, formal gardens were also built, designed to take advantage of the island's remarkable views across the bay. Inside were the main rooms, displaying handsome classical decorative details. We're talking high ceilings, period moldings, and a sense of quaint, deliberate grandeur. This wasn't your typical government building. While most naval houses of the era were strictly functional, this house, by contrast, was designed with a level of elegance usually reserved for the wealthy estates of San Francisco, suggesting that Quarters 1 was intended to be a proper home for a senior commanding officer, a building that conveyed both authority and hospitality. It was built to impress. Accordingly, in those early years, the mansion was the hub for the nation's top officers and guests. But then, in 1916, the training station was replaced by the center down in San Diego. Even so, this is where the island's purpose shifted, as it would soon host the man who would come to define its greater legacy. Chester William Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas, on February the 24th, 1885. Despite living in a landlocked region, his grandfather, Charles Nimitz, had built a hotel shaped like a steamboat, and it was on the steps of that hotel where young Chester first developed his fascination with the sea, listening to his grandfather's maritime stories for hours. In that spirit, he would go on to graduate from the Naval Academy in 1905 as the 7th in a class of 114 officers. Few, however, realized that this was the start of a career that would last nearly half a century and change the course of global history. Early on, Nimitz developed an expertise in submarine propulsion and demonstrated a gift for both engineering and leadership. By the late 1930s, he found himself in Washington as Chief of Bureau of Navigation. This was a prestigious desk job where he essentially ran the Navy's personnel, getting to know every officer under his command. Surprisingly, as a man of humility, he went as far as turning down the top jobs in the Pacific at least once, feeling that he wasn't senior enough for the opportunity. But that modesty wouldn't last long, because on December the 7th, 1941, everything changed when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The attack devastated the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships were burned and sank at their moorings, so it became pretty clear to leadership that dramatic steps were required to ensure the future safety of the United States. After the attack, FDR went looking for a new commander, and in a controversial twist, he didn't pick the most senior option. In fact, he passed over 28 admirals who outranked Nimitz just to give him the keys to the Pacific. Roosevelt's message was direct: get to Pearl Harbor, and don't come back until the war is won. And so it was. On December the 31st, 1941, on the deck of a submarine, Nimitz assumed command. What followed over the next 4 years was one of the most remarkable command performances in the history of modern warfare. Nimitz restored the shattered morale of a devastated fleet. He correctly identified Japanese plans for the Battle of Midway in June of 1942 and orchestrated a decisive American victory that turned the tide of the entire Pacific War. At the height of that war, he commanded more than 2 million men and women, 5,000 ships, and 20,000 aircraft. By December of 1944, Roosevelt promoted Nimitz to the Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the U.S. Navy, and a lifetime appointment. Though the Admiral's most notable moment came on September the 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. It was there that he signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender on behalf of the United States of America. In doing so, the Second World War in the Pacific came to a formal close. After the war, Nimitz served briefly as Chief of Naval Operations before retiring in 1947. As the 1960s arrived and his health began to decline, the Navy made a thoughtful gesture. They invited the old admiral to take up permanent residence in Quarters 1. And with the prospect of a staff, including a cook and a driver, Nimitz and his wife enthusiastically agreed. Apparently, the couple was also excited about the mix of natural beauty they'd have from their home and easy access to cultural events in the city. So, from then on, the mansion became a sanctuary of sorts. He hosted dignitaries from around the world, including many former adversaries from Japan, who now came as guests, paying their respects to the man who had defeated them. In the end, at the age of 80, Chester W. Nimitz passed away with his bride at his side in his home on February the 20th, 1966. In keeping with his reputation for humility, he requested to be buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery alongside the admirals that he had commanded during the Pacific War. The house continued to function as the official residence of senior naval officers after his passing. Rear Admiral John Biddulph lived there from 89 to 92 and described walking through the rooms and wondering about the home's spectacular past. Importantly, he and his wife Maureen devoted themselves to preserving the building's legacy. They did things like track down Nimitz's old paperboy for an interview, or they hosted the Admiral's daughter for dinner, and they also interviewed the last firefighter on the island who could remember the old Admiral. The couple went as far as refurbishing the home's interiors, including a desk that was restored in the library. Apparently, Biddulph placed the desk in the very spot where Nimitz had it, so that he could look out the window while he worked, contemplating many of the same predicaments. During Biddulph's tenure, the house also hosted the very first Soviet naval vessel to visit San Francisco since the Second World War. In what was described by some outlets as a touching turn of events, when the Soviet officers came ashore, their only request was to be photographed with the Admiral's portrait behind them. And it's probably a good thing that those interior photos were taken, since in 1991, when Biddulph retired, a downward spiral began. First, in 1993, the military base was closed as a part of the post-Cold War base realignment and closure process, leaving Quarters 1 abandoned. For context, more than 30 major bases in California alone were shuttered during that period. Then, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake caused a section of the Bay Bridge's upper deck to collapse, making the reconstruction of the bridge's eastern span an urgent necessity. Though, when engineers began designing the replacement, a dispute arose over the roadway's general alignment. This debate went on for nearly a decade, and in 1998, the Navy intervened when Caltrans engineers arrived on the island for a survey of their proposed design, a design that, I might add, had zero regard for historic preservation. The Navy determined that this new alignment would cast a shadow over what they saw as a monument. Hence, the military refused access. For the next 18 months, a massive legal standoff stalled the project. At one point, the Navy literally locked the gates, refusing to let engineers onto the island, while both sides fought over the federal preservation laws. It took a year and a half of redrawing blueprints to find a solution. Only after the bridge was redesigned to curve around the house could construction be resumed. Furthermore, this compromise brought the new span directly over the house, encasing it in a permanent canopy from the elements above. The solution spared the permanent shadow, but the house was subject to something arguably worse: complete isolation. So, with the dispute settled and the new Bay Bridge's eastern span under construction throughout the early 2000s, the Nimitz House entered a period of institutional uncertainty, a period that would prove to be its demise. In the new millennium, the house now had no occupants, no budget for restoration, and no clear plans for its future. About the only thing it had going for it was a legal designation that offered protection in name, but little in practice. This is where the Treasure Island Development Authority, the party responsible for the historic home, found itself caught between competing obligations. On one hand, the protective designation of the house meant that it could not be simply torn down or even fundamentally offered, yet there was no funding mechanism for its upkeep, and the constraints imposed by the designation, like limiting how much the structure could be modified, made renovation an expensive proposition. And all the while, the bay's weather was relentlessly battering the old structure. And I need to emphasize that the island's exposed location in the middle of that bay means that anything there takes a beating. So, without regular maintenance, longevity is impossible. This is why paint began peeling from the exterior. The porch ceiling fan warped until its wooden blades drooped towards the floor. And perhaps worst of all, some of the windows cracked, allowing water to enter the interior. And within just a few years of that moisture intrusion, some experts have suggested that the home is at risk of collapse. As for the artifacts that once populated those rooms, well, the historic record, at least what's publicly available, is surprisingly limited. Some accounts have suggested that when the house was vacated in the early 1990s, its furnishings simply disappeared. Though that assumption is somewhat unlikely, as the Naval History and Heritage Command maintains archives related to Nimitz and has most likely documented any known artifacts. Anyhow, in 2008, the Nimitz House received an additional layer of recognition when the Senior Officers' Quarters Historic District on Yerba Buena Island was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Effectively, this action joined Quarters 1 and the other senior officers' quarters, built around 1900, in a formally designated historic district. It was a meaningful step, an acknowledgement that the ensemble of buildings, not just the most famous house among them, deserved formal recognition. Still, The gesture, as great as it was, didn't secure funds for preservation. The following decades saw a modest attempt to keep the house alive in public memory, even as its physical condition continued to slip. Moreover, this is when the Treasure Island Museum became the primary institutional advocate for the building's stories. For example, they installed exhibits nearby, providing historical context for visitors. Then, in 2017, the Treasure Island Museum offered a rare treat for Fleet Week. They opened the doors to a special program in which retired Rear Admiral Bitoff personally led small groups through the house. This rare glimpse only further instigated public curiosity to the point that the monument found itself as a topic of discussion in the art world when a photograph of the home showcasing the classical facade dwarfed by the concrete geometry of the bridge overhead reached the finals of the Smithsonian Magazine annual photo contest. In conclusion, the Smithsonian described the work as, quote, an apt example of America's sometimes cavalier attitude towards its past, a notion that, indeed, reflects the reality of the situation. In 2025, Rear Admiral Bitoff, a man now in his 90s, continues to give passionate interviews about the decline of the house, with one publication quoting him and saying that it's hard for me to accept. And despite his calls for restoration, this masterpiece now sits forgotten, just a few hundred feet below thousands of people who pass over it daily. I, for one, hope to see it prevail against the odds, and it would seem that the only way to really do that might be through something like direct donations, bringing me to an unusual conclusion here. If any of you watching this are involved in the preservation of the Nimitz House and would like to join me for a more in-depth follow-up on the story, I'd be happy to get your word out by sharing my platform. I'll leave my contact information in the description below and hope to hear from you. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.